On the arid plateaus of the American Southwest, where the desert meets the sky and red canyons cut deep into the earth, there once existed a mysterious civilization, the Ancestral Puebloans, also known as the Anasazi. They did not build pyramids like the Maya, nor golden cities like the Aztec, but they left behind some of the most unique structures of ancient North America. The precarious cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the massive pueblos like Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, and the straight roads stretching hundreds of kilometers across the desert. For over a millennium, from around 100 to 1600 CE, the ancestral Puebloans transformed harsh lands into thriving homes. They planted maize, beans, and squash in dry soil, built irrigation canals and water reservoirs. They created complex societies with religious centers, sacred ceremonies in kivas, and exquisite black and white pottery. Then, one day, they vanished. Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde were abandoned, the cliff dwellings left with only bones and broken pottery. Their collapse, whether caused by drought, warfare, or religion, remains one of the greatest mysteries in North American history. Yet the ancestral Puebloans did not disappear entirely. Their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples such as the Hopi, Zuni, and Taos, still live in New Mexico and Arizona, preserving festivals, kivas, and ancestral memory. The ancestral Puebloans are not merely a lost civilization, but a bridge between past and present, between the red rock of the desert and the soul of a people. In today's American Southwest, where the Colorado Plateau stretches across 4 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, there once lived resilient people who dared to challenge a harsh land and lay the foundations of one of the most enigmatic civilizations of the Americas. They were the ancestral Puebloans, or Anasazi. Their beginnings did not start with towering cliff dwellings or straight roads through the desert, but with small communities bound to the soil, to maize and water, their 2 most sacred lifelines. Around 100 CE, their ancestors, whom archaeologists call the basket-maker people, appeared on the plateau. They lived in small villages, wove baskets, hence their name, grew maize, beans, and squash on dry soil, hunted deer and rabbits, and foraged the land. Their tools were simple, yet they crafted spears, bows and arrows, stone knives, and most importantly, they developed maize agriculture, a legacy from Mesoamerica. Maize was more than food, it was the foundation of Puebloan culture. Each kernel was seen as a sacred seed of life, tied to creation myths. Their choice to remain on this unforgiving plateau rather than migrate showed their faith in maize, that planting meant the gods would sustain them. The most distinctive feature of the early period was the kiva, round, semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers. From the earliest times, the kiva was the spiritual center of the community. In its flickering firelight, families gathered to retell ancestral myths, pray for rain and harvests. The kiva was not just a shelter, but a symbol of the link between people, earth, and sky. Over centuries, from about 500 CE, villages grew into larger communities. The Puebloans learned to build with stone and adobe, sun-dried clay mixed with straw. Rectangular houses stood side by side, gradually connecting into multi-storied clusters, the forerunners of their monumental pueblos. From simple adobe huts, they learned to bind hundreds of rooms into collective architecture. This marked a turning point, the leap from small villages to organized society. They also mastered water storage in a land with little rain. They dug reservoirs, built small dams to capture every precious drop. They understood that controlling water meant controlling life. This adaptation allowed them to endure in one of North America's harshest environments. Religion and belief shaped their daily lives. The Puebloans saw spirits in nature. The sun, moon, rain, thunder, wind, and earth all had deities. They carved petroglyphs of the sun, eagles, serpents, and celestial symbols into canyon walls, art that doubled as communication with the cosmos. Their society showed early signs of communal organization. There is no evidence of kings or absolute rulers. Instead, elders and priests led ceremonies, distributed food, and organized labor. It was a collective society where survival depended on cooperation more than individual power. In this era, from about 500 to 900 CE, the Puebloans laid the first stones of their civilization. They did not yet have their grand cliff dwellings or the mysterious Chaco Canyon, but they had maize planted in dry soil, kivas sunk into the earth, woven baskets filled with seeds, and the belief that they belonged to this land. When the sun set over the Colorado Plateau, its crimson light swept across the cliffs and shone into silent kivas. One can imagine the scene, a small community gathered by firelight, telling stories of ancestors emerging from the underworld, sowing maize, singing rain songs. This was the origin of the Ancestral Puebloans, people who turned barrenness into life, life into civilization, and prepared for the monumental works soon to rise in the desert. If the origins of the Ancestral Puebloans were marked by small villages and kivas sunk deep into the earth, then their golden age was immortalized through monumental architecture and vast social networks spread across the southwestern plateau. From around 900 to 1200 CE, across the deserts of New Mexico and the cliffs of Colorado, the Ancestral Puebloans created achievements that astonish the modern world. Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, and a system of perfectly straight roads and astronomical architecture of baffling precision. This was their most brilliant era, a time when a native civilization turned the desert into a center of religion, politics, and culture. The heart of this golden age was Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico. This was not a fertile valley, but a dry, wind-swept land. Yet from around 900 CE, Chaco became the hub of Puebloan power, filled with dozens of great houses, massive stone complexes containing hundreds, even thousands of rooms. Among them, Pueblo Bonito stood supreme. Shaped like a giant half-moon, it sprawled over nearly 3 hectares, rose 4 stories tall, and contained more than 600 rooms and dozens of kivas. It was not just a residence, but a ceremonial center, a storehouse, and perhaps even a seat of spiritual authority. The thick, hand-laid stone walls demonstrated sophisticated construction techniques and tight communal organization. What is most striking is that Chaco Canyon lacked the farmland and water to support tens of thousands of people. So why did it become the center? The answer lies in religion and ritual. Archaeologists have discovered that many Chaco structures were aligned precisely with the sun, moon, and stars. Pueblo Bonito, Chetro, and other great houses followed astronomical orientations, reflecting Puebloan cosmology. Chaco Canyon appears to have been a pilgrimage site where people from across the region gathered for ceremonies, offerings, and exchange. Chaco also stood out for its network of straight roads. From the canyon, dozens of wide, flattened roads, up to 9 meters across, stretched for tens or even hundreds of kilometers across the desert, linking villages and shrines. These roads did not bend to avoid hills or ravines. They cut straight through the landscape, as if designed to connect earth and sky, humans and gods. They were not ordinary trade routes, but ceremonial pathways, proof of a society bound by shared beliefs and purposes beyond mere survival. While Chaco was the religious hub, Mesa Verde in Colorado embodied Puebloan adaptation at its peak. By the 12th century, they began building cliff dwellings, fortified complexes tucked into high rock alcoves. The greatest of them, Cliff Palace, had over 150 rooms and 20 kivas, perched precariously on a sheer cliff. From a distance, the entire structure seemed to grow out of the rock itself, both inaccessible and awe-inspiring. These cliff dwellings were not only homes but fortresses against enemies and harsh conditions. Their elevated positions captured water from rainfall and snowmelt, while also offering protection from hostile groups. Each stone-walled chamber reflected extraordinary skill in both construction and communal organization. When moonlight bathed the cliffs of Mesa Verde, the dwellings seemed to glow, whispering the story of a people who carved homes out of stone itself. During this golden age, Puebloan art also reached new heights. Their black and white pottery, adorned with intricate geometric designs, appeared across the region. Pots, bowls, and jars decorated with spirals, lines, suns, snakes, and birds were not only beautiful but held religious meaning. They also crafted jewelry from turquoise, shells, bone, and feathers, turning ordinary materials into sacred treasures. Social life was tightly organized. Large communities were interconnected through Chaco Canyon. Kivas remained the heart of ceremonies, hosting dances, prayers, and perhaps even sacrifices. Puebloan religion was tied to the cycles of nature: sunrise and sunset, rain and drought, maize sprouting and harvest. To them, the universe was an eternal circle, and survival meant living in harmony with its rhythm. The golden age of the ancestral Puebloans is proof that even in the most arid lands, people could create centers of power and dazzling artistry. Chaco Canyon with Pueblo Bonito, Mesa Verde with Cliff Palace. These stand as eternal symbols of creativity, resilience, and belief. From kivas buried underground to cliff dwellings clinging to rock, from straight desert roads to sun-marked pottery, the ancestral Puebloans turned hardship into wonder and desert into civilization. If Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde are powerful evidence of the Puebloans' ability to build and organize communities, then their culture, religion, and daily life are the true soul of this civilization. The ancestral Puebloans did not merely survive on the arid plateau. They created their own worldview where every kernel of maize, every drop of rain, every star held meaning, where daily life was inseparably woven with ritual, art, and belief. Their religion revolved around a complex system of rituals and symbols deeply tied to nature. In their worldview, the universe was divided into three realms: the sky, where the gods dwelt; the earth, where humans lived; and the underworld, where the ancestors resided. The kiva, circular semi-subterranean chambers, served as the gateway connecting these worlds. Descending into a kiva was not just participating in ritual. It symbolized returning to the womb of the earth, to the ancestors, to seek strength and protection. In their ceremonies, the Puebloans prayed for rain, for crops, and for harmony between humans and nature. Maize was at the heart of all rituals. It was no accident that maize became their staple food. To them, maize was a divine gift. They told that their ancestors emerged from the earth along with maize, and that human life could never be separated from the corn plant. Each color of maize, white, yellow, red, blue, carried a distinct meaning, representing the four directions and the diversity of life. The Puebloans also revered animals as spiritual beings. The eagle, snake, and bear symbolized natural forces. The eagle soared close to the heavens, a messenger of the gods. The snake represented rain and fertility. The bear embodied strength and renewal after winter hibernation. These symbols were carved on stone, painted on pottery, and woven into textiles, forming a sacred language of belief. Another vital aspect of their spirituality was sun and moon rituals. Buildings in Chaco Canyon, especially Pueblo Bonito and the Fajada Butte Sun Dagger Observatory, were aligned with the sunrise and sunset on solstices, as well as the 18.6-year lunar cycle. This reveals that Puebloan priests were not just shamans, but also astronomers, watching the skies to determine planting, harvesting, and sacred ceremonies. In daily life, Puebloan society was highly communal. Homes were built close together, sharing common walls, reflecting their collective spirit. Families had private rooms, but activities often centered around plazas and kivas. Important decisions were made by councils of elders and priests, rather than kings or a ruling nobility as in many other civilizations. This relative equality helped maintain cohesion in a harsh environment. Women played a central role. They not only cooked, wove, and made pottery, but also safeguarded seeds and preserved agricultural knowledge. Many Puebloan communities were matrilineal. Lineage and property passed through the mother, and women often held decisive authority in households. This gave Puebloan society a distinctive character compared to the patriarchal systems of many other ancient cultures. Their most brilliant artistic legacy was pottery. They created black and white and later multicolored ceramics decorated with geometric patterns, spirals, rays, and animal motifs. Pots, bowls, and jars were used not only for daily needs, but also in rituals, burials, and trade. Every design carried spiritual meaning. Spirals symbolized wind, zigzags symbolized lightning, and circles symbolized the sun. Beyond pottery, they were also famous for their use of turquoise. Puebloans mined turquoise in New Mexico, crafting it into beads, pendants, and earrings, which they traded far afield, even into Mesoamerica. Turquoise symbolized water, rain, and life, a precious adornment but also a sacred talisman. Music and dance were indispensable. In festivals, hand drums, wooden flutes, and conch shell trumpets resonated, accompanying dances that mimicked eagles flying, snakes slithering, or corn sprouting. The Puebloans believed dancing was not for entertainment, but a cosmic duty, rituals that kept the universe in balance. If humans stopped dancing, the sun might stop rising, and the rain might cease to fall. Children grew up immersed in this world, learning to plant maize, make pottery, weave, hunt, and above all, to remember their ancestors' stories. Through the words of elders, they learned that humans had emerged from the earth, that kivas were portals to the ancestral realm, and that every act was tied to the cosmos. This education bound communities together generation after generation. Throughout Puebloan culture, there was a complete merging of life and religion. There was no boundary between planting corn and worshiping the corn god, between building a home and building a kiva, between making pottery and creating cosmic symbols. To them, every act was sacred. This belief nourished their strength and allowed them to endure for centuries on the unforgiving plateau. Today, when you step into a surviving kiva at Mesa Verde, smelling the damp earth, seeing the fire pit and ventilation shaft, it is as if you can still hear distant drums, prayers for rain, and the stories of ancestors. The culture and life of the ancestral Puebloans live on not only in pottery, stone, or cliffs, but in the very spaces where humans and gods once met. No civilization can fully resist the harshness of nature. For the ancestral Puebloans, the prosperity of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde was no exception. After centuries of building monumental structures, worshipping their gods, and cultivating maize on arid soil, they faced the greatest trial in their history, a prolonged drought. That, combined with internal tensions and social upheaval, drove the Puebloan civilization to the brink of collapse. By the late 12th century, archaeological evidence shows that the American Southwest endured a devastating drought lasting decades. Rainfall plummeted, springs dried up, and the earth cracked. For a society entirely dependent on maize agriculture, the lack of water was a fatal blow. The irrigation canals and reservoirs that once sustained Chaco Canyon lay empty. Crops failed, famine spread, children were malnourished, and human remains show signs of severe hunger. At the same time, population pressures mounted. Puebloan communities had grown too large while resources dwindled. Tensions between groups flared into armed conflict. Archaeological sites reveal traces of violence: burned walls, fractured skulls, butchered bones. The Puebloans, once united in kivas and plazas, now turned on one another for water, food, and farmland. It was in this context that the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were built. Many scholars believe the move from open plateau villages into hidden rock alcoves was for defense. Cliff dwellings like Cliff Palace were not merely homes, but fortresses where communities could shield themselves from enemies. This shift suggests that Puebloan society was no longer peaceful, but riven with conflict. Meanwhile, Chaco Canyon, the spiritual heart of their golden age, fell into decline. The great houses were gradually abandoned. Pueblo Bonito, once a mysterious sanctuary, became silent. The straight roads connecting villages ceased to be used. A religious and cultural center that once blazed like the sun turned to dust in the desert. Other factors may have hastened their downfall. Some researchers argue that social inequality, when priests and leaders concentrated power, forcing commoners to build massive monuments, bred resentment. In times of crisis, such injustice deepened fractures. Evidence of cannibalism at some sites, possibly ritualistic or desperate responses to famine, reveals the extreme severity of their plight. By the 13th century, the Colorado Plateau, once dotted with villages, was almost entirely abandoned. Mesa Verde, with its hundreds of cliff dwellings, was left as silent stone walls. The Puebloans departed their ancestral homeland, migrating south and southeast in search of more reliable water, along the Rio Grande into Arizona and New Mexico. This migration did not happen all at once, but stretched over centuries, scattering communities into smaller, more resilient groups. New settlements arose at Acoma Pueblo, Taos Pueblo, and the Hopi Mesas, places that still exist today. These villages testify to survival and adaptation, but also to the end of an era. The ancestral Puebloans no longer built great houses or monumental cliff dwellings. They downsized, focusing on communities just large enough to endure the unforgiving land. By the 16th century, when the Spanish arrived in the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, as a unified civilization, had vanished. They were no longer an empire or a cultural center, but dispersed descendants known as the Pueblo peoples. Yet even as the name Anasazi faded into the past, the memory of those who built Pueblo Bonito, Cliff Palace, the straight roads, and the sacred kivas still echoed in every surviving Pueblo village. The fall of the ancestral Puebloans is a poignant reminder of civilization's fragility before nature. No foreign army conquered them. No invading empire burned Chaco Canyon. Their only enemies were drought, famine, and their own divisions. When the water disappeared, when maize no longer grew, when the gods fell silent, even the most resilient society could not stand. Today, when we gaze at the cliffs of Mesa Verde, where empty stone dwellings cling to the rock, or stand among the ruins of Pueblo Bonito, listening to the wind whistle through broken walls, we feel the emptiness. These are not just ruins, they are echoes of a civilization that bowed to the relentless power of nature. When Chaco Canyon had become nothing more than crumbling walls, when Mesa Verde lay silent among the cliffs, many believed the ancestral Puebloans had vanished like a barren dream. But the truth is, they never disappeared. They only changed, migrating, adapting, and continuing to live on through the modern Pueblo peoples. Within them, the legacy of the ancestral Puebloans still burns. Not as a lost past, but as a living present. The direct descendants of the ancestral Puebloans are the Pueblo groups of New Mexico and Arizona: Hopi, Zuni, Taos, Acoma, Laguna, Jemez, Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, and many others. Each community has its own distinct character, yet all preserve traditions, beliefs, and customs of their ancestors. Villages like Taos Pueblo or Acoma Pueblo, Sky City, are still inhabited today with multi-storied adobe houses and festivals that have followed the same rhythms for hundreds of years. One of the most vital legacies is language. Modern Pueblo peoples speak a variety of tongues: Hopi, Zuni, Keres, Tewa, Tiwa, all rooted in ancestral traditions. Language is the bridge between past and present, the means by which they preserve creation myths, pass on sacred rituals, and keep ancestral memory alive. Their beliefs and rituals also remain vibrant. Though Christianity left a deep mark after the Spanish conquest, many Pueblo communities still maintain traditional ceremonies inside kivas, the same ceremonial chambers their ancestors once used. In today's kivas, the Pueblo still pray for rain and harvest, dance to the beat of drums, and honor maize as the seed of the soul, the eagle as the messenger of the gods. Festivals like the Hopi Poamuya, winter ceremony, or the Zuni Shalako festival are direct continuations of ancestral Puebloan traditions, living proof that their religion was never erased. Pueblo art is another living heritage. Modern Pueblo potters still handcraft ceramics without the potter's wheel, painting geometric motifs, suns, and animals, just as their ancestors did in Chaco and Mesa Verde. World-famous pottery, such as that of Maria Martinez of San Ildefonso, shows how a 1,000-year-old tradition can be both timeless and modern. Pueblo weaving, turquoise jewelry, and crafts are also direct continuations of ancestral Puebloan artistry. The legacy is visible in architecture and community life. Multi-storied adobe houses at Taos Pueblo remain inhabited and are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, much like Monte Alban for the Zapotec or Angkor for the Khmer. Taos Pueblo is considered the oldest continuously inhabited village in North America, where architecture, culture, and people have coexisted for over a millennium. For humanity, the ancestral Puebloans left behind priceless archaeological treasures. Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, attracting millions of visitors each year. Walking along the cliffs of Mesa Verde, peering into the hundreds of rooms of Cliff Palace, or standing inside the vast half-moon of Pueblo Bonito, one does not just see stone and mortar, but can almost hear echoes from the past, the beating of kiva drums, the rustle of corn, the prayers for rain whispered into the desert wind. The ancestral Puebloans also left behind a lesson for history. They proved that a civilization could flourish for centuries even in one of the harshest environments if it cooperated, organized, and harmonized with nature. But they also revealed the fragility of civilization before climate change and internal division. The lesson of the 12th and 13th century drought and the fall of Chaco Canyon still holds meaning for humanity today. Most importantly, the ancestral Puebloans left an identity that cannot be erased. They did not vanish like Tiwanaku or the Indus Valley. They continue in the lives of today's Pueblo peoples. When the Hopi perform the Kachina dances, when the Zuni tell the stories of Shalako, when drums echo in the kivas, it is the ancestral Puebloans still living. When we stand at Mesa Verde, gazing at the silent cliff dwellings, or watch the sun set across Chaco Canyon, we understand that the ancestral Puebloans never truly disappeared. They simply transformed from an ancient civilization into a living people. And in every kernel of corn, every song, every dance, they remind the world that humanity can endure and create even in the harshest of lands. On the arid plateau of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans wrote a remarkable chapter in human history. They had no golden pyramids, no mighty empire, yet they left behind Chaco Canyon with Pueblo Bonito, Mesa Verde with its cliff dwellings, the straight ceremonial roads through the desert, and the sacred kivas that bound people to their ancestors. For over 1,000 years, they planted maize on dry soil, prayed for rain in kivas, crafted pottery and turquoise jewelry, and studied the sky to build a sacred calendar. But drought, famine, and conflict forced them to abandon Chaco and Mesa Verde, dispersing into smaller communities. Many thought they disappeared, but the truth is they never did. Today, in the Hopi drums, in the Zuni dances, in the adobe homes of Taos Pueblo and Sky City, Acoma, the ancestral Puebloans still live. They live in language, in festivals, in kivas, and in the memory passed down through generations. They live in the ruins, honored by UNESCO, where millions return each year to hear the desert's echo. The ancestral Puebloans stand as proof that even in aridity, humanity can create, organize, and connect with the cosmos. And when we watch the sun set over Mesa Verde, we know their story has not ended. It continues in every kernel of maize, every song, every Pueblo soul today.